The Trail of Tears was a dark page in American history, forcing Native Americans from their homelands and taking advantage of their rights. Through the Trail of Tears, white settlers portrayed that they were indifferent to Native American culture and mostly concerned with expanding westward. As a result of this indifference, Native Americans suffered an uprooting from their homeland, starvation, disease, and even extinction. The Trail of Tears. The catalyst of the Trail of Tears was Jackson's Indian Removal Bill of 1830, which forcibly removed all eastern Native Americans to Indian Territory west of the Mississippi River. However, Indian indifference was long brewing before this date, and greatly contributed to the harshness of the Trail of Tears. The Indians had always been a problem for the settlers. Many presidents of the past had the hope of moving Indians further west in order to open up more lands. However, westward expansion increased during Jackson's presidency, as did the urgency of the Indian problem. So Jackson hurriedly signed the Indian Removal Act in order to fulfill the whites' land lust, even if it meant stripping a native people from their homeland. Jackson himself shared the view that most white settlers had of the Indians. He saw them as a roadblock, a festering sore that prevented colonization of this great land. This belief made the Indian Removal Act extremely indifferent to Indian culture. It uprooted all eastern Native Americans from their land and everything they knew to make the 1,000-mile journey west of the Mississippi. The government was indifferent to the fact that land was important to the Native Americans. They saw it as a gift from the Great Spirit to be used wisely. When the government stripped the Indians of their land, it was stripping them of their beliefs and their culture. Even worse, Jackson tried to make a moral standpoint on the Indian Removal Act to cover up the government's land lust. He claimed that the Native Americans would be able to retain their culture out west in a permanent reservation. However, Jackson blindly ignored the fact that the Indians did not want to leave. Indians resisted the indifferent government, but with little avail. In Florida, the Seminole Indians engaged in a 7-year-long warfare with American troops. Some lucky Indians escaped to the Everglades, but most were hauled in the forced evacuation from their homelands. The Sioux, under Black Hawk, resisted too. Feeling powerless against the white man, they fought. When American troops arrived to fight the Sioux into cooperating, they spotted a flag of truce. Ignoring the attempt at peace, American troops killed some 500 Sioux in cold blood, including women and children. Instead of acknowledging the fact that the Indians did not want to give up their land and culture, the Americans fought the Indians into submission any way that they could. The harshest blows came on the 5 civilized tribes, especially the Cherokees. The fact that they were mostly assimilated and had even intermarried with the whites won them no sympathy with the government. They were uprooted and forced to move like every other eastern tribe. The Cherokees fought back by taking their case to the Supreme Court, which declared that the Cherokees had the right to their land and that the states could not take over tribal lands. In a complete violation of the Supreme Court and previously signed treaties, Jackson claimed, "John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it." It was clear that the government did not tolerate Native American diversity. They uprooted Indians from their homeland and took away their legal rights. The government even manipulated the fact that many Indian tribes didn't understand land ownership by proposing treaties to them. Tribal leaders were forced to sign treaties without even realizing that they were giving up their lands by doing so. As Black Hawk later lamented, "I touched the goose quill to the treaty, not knowing, however, that by that act I consented to give away my village." Although the Jackson administration claimed that they were preserving Indian culture by moving the Indians away from white encroachments, this was far from the truth. Besides the killings of Indians who did not comply with the evacuation, the uncareful planning of the trip portrays that the government did not really care what happened to the Indians as long as they ended up past the Mississippi. Special needs were not taken into account. People were miscounted. The Indians were already weak and ill. The food supply was insufficient, and there were not enough horses or wagons. The trip was planned during the winter, while most Indians had summer clothes. The government promised payments for what the Indians had to leave behind, but these payments arrived too late to help. Settlers even portrayed a cruelty by winning a profit off of the Indian struggle. Some charged the Native Americans tolls for crossing their land, and others raised prices for supplies the Indians needed to survive. Had the government planned the trip better, this could have been avoided. Soon many Indians fell to cholera, leaving some 4,000 Cherokees dead. The problems did not end after the migration. Many Indians found themselves abandoned by the government, who forced them to move. Epidemics plagued the tribes, but the government mostly ignored them for personal gain. Hostility occurred between the tribes because tribes had already settled out west, and the new tribes were intruding on their land. Increasing this hostility was the fact that the white settlers had decimated the buffalo to the near point of extinction, and so tribes fought over food and survival. As predicted during the Trail of Tears, many tribes became extinct, their names, languages, and origins forgotten. In fact, mostly due to the government's indifference of the Native Americans' fate, 1/2 of the early immigrants died within the first year. Perhaps the harshest broken promise to the Indians came from the promise of a permanent Indian reservation to the west of the Mississippi. Like many other promises of the federal government to the Indians, this promise fell flat when settlers expanded further and further westward. In 15 years, this permanent Indian territory was almost non-existent. The Indians suffered a broken sense of unity and a broken sense of purpose, but while other tribes disappeared, the Cherokees were determined to survive. They built a new homeland, complete with schools, farms, homes, and churches, and even developed the Cherokee Heritage Center to preserve Cherokee history and culture. Currently, they are the largest Indian group in the United States. Even though the Cherokee survived, the many tribes that didn't haunt America's history. Had the United States been more tolerant and accepting of Indian culture, the Indians might not have had to evacuate in the first place. But if they did, the trip would have been planned more carefully. The Native Americans would have been given more assistance to survive and preserve their culture. The forgotten names and the forgotten tribes of the Trail of Tears will forever stand in America's history as a symbol of white settlers' indifference and a reminder of the destruction intolerance can cause.